There was a time when losing a paycheck didn't mean losing a family, because Grandma knew how to turn almost nothing into a table full of food and never let the kids see her worry. Some of what she made we didn't understand until years later, but not once did we go to bed hungry. It started the week Grandpa came home and didn't say a word at dinner. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody asked. Grandma didn't ask either. She just cooked like she always did. That first week, she leaned on what she always kept on hand. The things that never ran out, even when everything else did. Beans and cornbread. Back then, it was the difference between an empty table and a full one. Grandma kept a sack of dry beans and a bag of cornmeal in the pantry, no matter what. She'd soak the beans overnight, then let them simmer low all day with whatever she had on hand. A bit of onion, sometimes a piece of salt pork if there was any left. By evening, the whole house smelled like dinner was coming, even on the nights when dinner almost wasn't. The cornbread was simple too. Just cornmeal, a little white lily flour, buttermilk if they had it, water if they didn't. She'd pour it into a hot skillet so it came out with that crust on the bottom the kids used to fight over. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, it was filling, and it was there every single night that first week. Steady, the same way she was. Milk gravy over biscuits. By the second week, Grandma had already started thinking further ahead than just that night's dinner. Milk gravy over biscuits became a regular one. Flour, a little fat from whatever meat they'd had earlier in the week, and milk stirred slow over the stove until it thickened up into something that could cover a whole plate of biscuits and make it feel like a real meal. The biscuits themselves were cheap to make and cheaper to stretch. A little flour, a spoonful of Crisco straight out of the tin she kept by the stove, buttermilk if there was any left in the jug. She'd split them open and pour the gravy over top. And for a few minutes at that table, nobody was thinking about what wasn't there. They were just eating. Fried potatoes and onions. Potatoes were one of the few things Grandma never had to worry about running out of, because Grandpa had put in a small patch out back the year before, more out of habit than planning. But it turned out to be one of the most important things he ever did for that family without even meaning to. Fried potatoes and onions became one of Grandma's go-to meals, sliced thin and cooked slow and
bacon grease. Big old glob.
And a little crisp at the edges. It was a simple dish, but Grandma had a way of making it feel like more than it was. She'd season it just right, let it sit in the pan a little longer than most people would, and by the time it hit the table, it smelled like something worth sitting down for. Nobody complained. Nobody even thought to. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was one of those meals that could go either way, depending on the night. Some evenings, Grandma would sweeten it a little with whatever sugar or molasses she had left and serve it almost like a dessert. Other nights, when there wasn't much else in the house, she'd serve it plain and savory, sometimes with a bit of gravy poured over top to make it feel like a full dinner instead of what it really was. It cost almost nothing to make, just cornmeal and water, cooked down slow until it thickened. But Grandma never let it feel like a lesser meal. She served it the same way she served everything, with the same care, like it was exactly what she'd planned to make all along. Vegetable soup from scraps. As the weeks went on, Grandma started leaning harder on the garden and whatever she could stretch out of it. Vegetable soup became a near nightly thing. Whatever was ready to pick, whatever scraps hadn't gone into something else earlier in the week, all of it going into one pot with water and a little seasoning. Some nights it was thin, some nights it was thicker when there was more to put in it, but it was always there. She'd serve it with a slice of bread on the side, sometimes the heel of a loaf that nobody else wanted, just to fill people up a little more. It wasn't the kind of soup you'd find written down in a cookbook. It was the kind of soup that came from watching what was left in the garden and figuring out how to make it feed 6 people instead of 2. Poor man's steak. By the time a month had passed with Grandpa still out of work, meat had become something the family barely saw anymore. So Grandma got resourceful. She'd take what little ground meat she could afford, stretch it further with a handful of crushed saltine crackers, press it thin, and fry it up in a pan until it browned. Then she'd cover it in gravy, the same way she covered so many other meals that month, because gravy had a way of making a little bit of meat taste like a whole lot more. They called it poor man's steak, and everybody at that table knew exactly why. It wasn't a real steak, it never pretended to be. But it was meat, it was hot, and for one night it made the family feel like they were still eating the way they used to, even if they weren't. Fried mush. Nothing in Grandma's kitchen ever went to waste, and the leftover cornmeal mush from earlier in the week was no exception. She'd let it set overnight until it firmed up, then slice it thin the next morning and fry it in a hot pan until the edges turned golden and a little crisp. Sometimes she'd serve it with a little syrup, other times plain with nothing on it at all. It was a small thing, turning yesterday's dinner into today's breakfast, but it meant one less thing to worry about buying, one less meal to figure out from scratch at a time when every little bit mattered more than it ever had before. Depression cake. There was one night, right in the thick of it, when Grandma made something the kids didn't fully understand until they were grown. A cake with no eggs, no milk, and no butter. Because there simply wasn't any of it in the house. Just flour, sugar if there was enough of it, water, a spoonful of Crisco, and whatever spice she had left on the shelf. People back then called it depression cake, and it earned that name honestly, born out of the very same hardship that had landed on their own kitchen table. Grandma never called it that at the table. She just called it cake, set it down after dinner like it was nothing out of the ordinary, and let the kids eat it without knowing what it had cost her to figure out how to make a cake out of almost nothing at all. Potato soup. The potato soup that had started thick in the early weeks got thinner as time went on. Not because Grandma wanted it that way, but because there were more nights to stretch it across than there were potatoes to stretch it with. She added a little more water, a little more onion, whatever she could to make the same amount of food go further without anyone noticing the difference. Nobody at that table ever said the soup tasted thinner than it used to. Maybe they didn't notice. Maybe they noticed and didn't say anything. The same way Grandma never said anything about why it had changed. Either way, the pot got emptied every single night. Water gravy. There was one meal that year that Grandma rarely talked about afterward, and it was the one that came the closest to showing just how bad things had gotten. Water gravy. Flour, water, salt. Nothing else. No milk, no drippings, because there was nothing left to make it with. She poured it over whatever bread or biscuits were left and served it like it was a full meal, because that night it had to be. It was the leanest meal of that whole stretch, and everyone at that table felt it, even if nobody said it out loud. But Grandma still set the table the same way she always did. She still sat down with them, and when it was over, she still told them there'd be something better tomorrow. And somehow, there always was. Chicken and dumplings. This was the meal the kids still talk about all these years later. The one from the very beginning of this story. The one none of them fully understood the meaning of until they were grown. Grandma had one chicken, and one chicken had to feed the family not once, but twice. She cooked it low and slow until the meat pulled easily from the bone, saved the broth, and dropped soft dumplings right into it until the whole pot turned thick and rich. The first night, they ate it as chicken and dumplings, plates full, everybody going back for seconds. The second night, she stretched what was left even further, added a little more broth, a few more vegetables from the garden, and served it again like it was a brand new meal. Nobody at that table ever forgot how one chicken managed to feel like more than enough twice. Hoover Stew. Every so often, Grandma would try to make a Sunday feel like a Sunday, even in the middle of everything. She'd take whatever scrap meat was left in the icebox, a couple of hot dogs, and boil them down with canned tomatoes and whatever macaroni or beans she had in the pantry. People had started calling it Hoover Stew after the president everyone blamed for the hard times, and Grandma made it more than once that year without ever saying the name out loud. It wasn't the same as the Sundays before Grandpa lost his job, and everyone at that table knew it. But there was still something about sitting down to a pot that had been simmering all afternoon, something that made it feel like an occasion instead of just another meal to get through. Cornbread and Buttermilk. When even the small extras had run thin, Grandma leaned back on the simplest thing she knew how to make. A slice of cornbread crumbled into a glass of buttermilk, eaten as its own meal. It was one of the plainest things she ever served that year, and also one of the most honest. There was no dressing it up as anything more than what it was. But there was something about the way she served it that made it feel like more than a shortcut. She'd sit down with her own bowl, crumble the cornbread slowly, and eat it right alongside the kids, like it was exactly what she'd wanted that night, not just what was left. Nobody at that table ever remembered her complaining about it, not once, not even when the same bowl showed up 2 or 3 nights in a row. It filled a stomach, it cost almost nothing, and it meant there was still something to put on the table that night, even when there wasn't much left to put there. Fried salt pork and gravy. A little salt pork sliced thin and fried until it crisped at the edges, with gravy made from the drippings poured over biscuits or whatever bread was left. It was salty, it was simple, and it was one of the meals that stretched the furthest on the least amount of anything Grandma had left in the house. By this point, she'd learned exactly how thin she could slice that salt pork and still make it feel like there was meat on the plate. She'd let the fat render down slow, scrape every bit of it into the gravy so nothing was wasted, and pour it heavy over the biscuits so the plate looked fuller than what was actually on it. Grandma never let on how lean this meal really was. She served it the same way she served the chicken and dumplings, with the same table set the same way, the same seat for everyone, like nothing about that night was any different from the rest. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Grandpa came home one evening, and for the first time in months, he wasn't quiet at the table. Nothing was said about it directly, not at first, but Grandma knew, the same way she'd known the first night something was wrong, back when he came home and didn't say a word at all. That Sunday, she was up early, and the kids knew something was different before anyone told them, just from the smell coming out of that kitchen. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, a full plate, the kind of meal that hadn't been on that table in a long time. She fried the chicken the way she always used to, before things got hard, and mashed the potatoes with real butter for the first time in months instead of the Crisco she'd been rationing all along. Nobody said why. Nobody had to. Losing a paycheck back then didn't mean losing a family, not in that house, because Grandma made sure of it, one meal at a time, without ever letting the kids see how hard she was working to keep it that way. Some of what she made that year, none of them understood until they were grown enough to look back and realize just how little she had to work with and just how much she managed to make out of it. If any of these meals brought back a memory of your own, or a grandmother who did the same thing in her own kitchen, we'd love to hear about it. There's another story just like this one, about the meals Grandma made to keep Grandpa fed through the hardest years of his work. You'll see it on your screen now. Thank you. I will see you in the next one.